or read about them. And I'm going to try and use this at the same time and look at some notes. And I know that quite a few of the seminars that you've heard on disabled voices have taken more of a figurative approach to considering disabled voices. Today I'm actually going to take a very literal interpretation. When I moved to the States 20 years ago, I started working with people who had little or no speech. And most of them had severe physical impairments. And I work with adults and children, and later on predominantly children for my doctoral research. And I was working on their communication, and this involved working with speech generation, dedicated computers, communication boards. And really, my focus was to work with them on academics and having a social life, training partners of communication in the community, supporting their language and literacy development, and really finding a voice and having some autonomy because of having an independent voice. For the last 6 years, I've been working with the International Board on Books. They have a committee on outstanding books for young people with disabilities. Now, I'm not sure that I particularly like that title, but I started approaching them some years ago and worked with the international section. Incidentally, has anybody heard of IBI UK? Well, you should get to know IBI UK because the International Board on Books for Young People is a really big international group. And IBI UK also has an outstanding Books for Young People with Disabilities committee. You might want to get involved with reviewing yourself sometime. Anyway, for the last 6 years, I've been doing a lot of reviews of books. For the last 4 years, I've been working on books that have been published in the United States, and the last 2 years, I've been chairing that committee. And just to give you an idea, over the last 4 years, we've probably reviewed over 300 books, about 100 of them novels, and there are 3 categories. So one of the categories of books is books specifically produced in specialized formats, in Braille, bliss symbols, tactile books, books supplemented with sign language. A second category is very simple text with simple illustrations that are suitable for people with developmental disabilities to learn literacy lessons and concepts as well. And then a third category is books with representations of disabilities. So these might be picture books to novels, biographies, and so forth. And about 100 of the books I've reviewed have been these longer books with portrayals of disability in them. The centre, all the nominating committees around the world send their favourite books that they're nominating to a centre in Toronto Public Library, and they have a collection that tours the world. So there are 2 different book collections, and you can order them to libraries and things. They go around conferences, so they get a lot of publicity. And they're in 40 different languages, and you can order the catalogue from IBI as well, or download it. It's produced every 2 years. So, why be interested in looking at literature for young people? Well, we know that kids don't simply read books and learn to read and just kind of read at a very literal level. They're actually interpreting the culture around them. So we know that we're really learning to read the world through literature. And many people, and particularly Mitchell and Snyder, have seen how disability has been used as a prompt and a prop, even in children's literature. In fact, I would say particularly in children's literature. a few years ago with a colleague, Hank Bassani, when I was still Myers at that point, Chloe Myers. Hank and I developed a way of analysing ableism in kids' literature, and we called it 10 Quick Ways to review children's literature for ableism. And we then used this tool to look at the Caldecott Award winners. And the Caldecott Award winners are considered kind of the best of the very best. It's about a little bit like getting a Kate Greenaway Award here. And at that point there were 73 books, and the award been going since 1937. Of the 17, 14 had representations of disability. Only 2 were remotely positive of those 14, and only 1 had a remotely 3-dimensional portrayal of disability. So there's a lot we can read into in children's literature. And in the United States, part of my job is I'm in teacher education. And also before I was in teacher education, I went into multiple classrooms supporting young people with their communication and their literacy. I suppose I've been in 200 to 400 different classrooms over the years. And, you know, I always have a little route around on bookshelves to see, you know, what's there. It's always worth doing. And this book, which was produced just in 1996, was widely available in classrooms that I went and worked in. And if you can get past this awful title, who cares about disabled people, you know? This is sort of one of the main types of books that I found in classrooms, a very pedagogical, quasi-clinical approach to teaching about disabilities. And we've just chosen a few pictures here. On these pictures here, there's a very much a kind of minimalising what people might go through with a disability. On one page it's saying that nearly everybody is handicapped in some way, and being tall can be a handicap, and being very talented and playing a violin when other children are playing can be a handicap. So it kind of minimalises what people might go through with their disability. And then on these pages, perhaps my favourite, I say in a sarcastic voice, we can handicap ourselves by drinking alcohol, by taking drugs and smoking. So what's the message here to young people as they read this book?
And that's how everybody got impairment.
Yeah, yeah. Brought it on themselves probably, right? So, and then the next set of pages, we may need to be very patient, especially with the very young or the very old. Kind of giving the message that disability makes one an eternal child. So there's this type of book available in many classrooms. And then, of course, there's a lot of literature too, and I love literature. And I think story is probably a far more powerful means to create a relationship between children without disabilities and children with disabilities, when we get really good stories. And so I'm more interested in books of this nature. Fox by Margaret Wilde is an interesting book. It was published first in Australia, then it was published in the US in 2006. And it's about a forest fire, and it's pretty stunning to look at because the text is written in charcoal and it looks like it's being taken straight from the forest fire. And the 3 characters involve Fox, who's a little bit wily and very lonely. Then there's Magpie, who burnt her wing in the forest fire. And there's Dog, who lost an eye. So within the story, we get a point where Magpie is being stared at by Fox, and she is feeling a lot of kind of shame. I should backtrack a little. Dog and magpie have created quite a powerful relationship between each other. Magpie is very sad that she can no longer fly, and Dog says, look, I'll be your wings, and you can help me with my vision. And so she gets onto Dog's back, and they support each other. And then Fox comes in, and because he's lonely, he wants to, be part of this relationship. Magpie is very worried about Fox and kind of excludes him. And he keeps saying to her, Magpie, why don't you come on my back? I can run a lot faster than Dog, you'll really fly when you come with me. And eventually she is lured by the fox. So again, kind of, there's a message that perhaps individuals with disabilities are easily hoodwinked into situations, the perpetual child again. After taking her off, he dumps her into the desert, and it says here, he shakes Magpie off his back as he would a flea. So there's a lot of disdain, and he leaves her in the desert, and Magpie can hear him screaming, and we're not sure whether it's out of triumph or despair. And we're not altogether sure whether Magpie's actually going to make it back to Dog again. So I think this is a very interesting book, and I never say, let's censor books. So the censorship is very prominent in the US in schools. I always think there's work to do on books and discussions to be had. But it was rather surprising to me that this book won a lot of awards. It was a Cape Greenaway on the short list for Cape Greenaway Awards. It won multiple awards in Australia. And lo and behold, in 2007, that little catalogue I showed you of the outstanding books for disabilities, it was in that catalogue. And that's where I thought, I've got to get involved somehow, although I think it's a good book. I'm not sure that it sends some of the messages that I would want to be sending in terms of setting up relationships.
Is that the end of the story?
It ends a few pages there. I've obviously had to eclipse things for the purposes of that, but it's only a couple more pages.
Ending for a children's book.
It is very depressing. And, I think there's a place for depressing things sometimes, but I don't like it when there's no kind of means to discuss what's going on. And I think it was, I think the awards were given because it was kind of shocking in many ways, and not necessarily that it was teaching some great lessons. Very good point. So I encourage you to get involved of reviews of literature. And today for this presentation, I'm going to be particularly talking about literature where we see presentations of impairments that affect communication. Paperboy by Vince Porter is set in Memphis in 1959. Some time before the Civil Rights Movement. We hear stories of segregation, a lot of different things going on in this book. And the character, the protagonist, Victor, has a stutter. Words in the Dust. Anybody know this book? No, it came over here. Trent Reedy is the author, and it includes Zuleika, who's portrayed on the front here, who has a cleft palate, and it's based partly on Trent Reedy's experiences in Afghanistan in the US Restoration Project. I'm sure you must know the name Temple Grandin. Anybody interested in autism? This is a biography of Temple Grandin, how the girl who loved cows embraced autism and changed the world. And Out of My Mind by Sharon Draper is a book about a young person with cerebral palsy who uses, eventually gets to use speech generation as part of her communication system. And it's about her not straightforward inclusion in schools. And so when I'm looking at books, although I obviously did this little kind of rubric thing with Hank Balsani some years ago to help me kind of think about ableism and stereotypes in books, I like to look through a number of different lenses. And one of the lenses I use is a hierarchy of disabilities. Anybody familiar with this hierarchy? So I'm not sure how much has been done in the UK here, but Tringo in 1970 did a study about how people viewed disabilities and how much social distance they favoured according to disabilities. And he found that some disabilities people were more favourable toward than others. So physical and sensory impairments were favoured in terms of proximity rather than neurological or psychogenic impairments that might involve kind of mental health issues, intellectual disabilities. That study has been replicated by many, many people. So it's been replicated across continents, it's been replicated across ethnicities, it's been replicated across domains and disciplines. So it's been done with athletes, it's been done with teachers who are going into teaching, teachers already in the field, it's been done with medics. What's been surprising is that there's been quite a lot of constancy in terms of the results gleaned, and it's also been done with people with disabilities and people who do not have disabilities, and again similar sort of results. Stephanie Hughes, who's a speech language pathologist, replicated the study in 2012, and she put in some communication disorders to see how people viewed those as well. And she very much found that less complicated communication disorders that might affect articulation were favoured over communication disorders that might also have implications with intellectual disabilities and might be visible. So cleft palate would be less well favoured than stuttering. And people were asking on this scale things like, would you want to marry a person? Would you want them as your neighbour? Would you want them, would you want to keep a distance from them? Would you want to work with them? Would you even feel that they shouldn't live? These kinds of things. Pretty brutal stuff. I think it's important to know this stuff if we're looking at prejudice, though, because the level of prejudice that we might see in the text might replicate this too. And I think we need to be able to answer difficult questions, particularly in my line of work where I'm working with teachers who get difficult questions and things. I also look through who's telling the story in the book? What's the voice? Is it a third-person account? Is it told in the first person? And I look at the relationship that the author has with disability. Do they have a disability themselves? Do they have experience with disability? So using just this lens then, when I look at Paperboy, stuttering is 8th out of the 25 disabilities, so relatively low in terms of wanting a great distance. So it's seen more favourably than autism right at the bottom here, 20th out of 25. Paperboy is a semi-autobiographical story, so Vince Porter, the author, also has a stutter, and it's based on his personal experiences growing up in Memphis. Words in the Dust, cleft palate or cleft lip, is 17th on this hierarchy. It's told in the first person. It's a fictionalized story based on the author's experience working within this reconstruction unit in the US, and they encounter a child with a cleft palate. Out of My Mind, Cerebral Palsy is 19th of the 25. It's told in the first person, and Melody has cerebral palsy. Sharon Draper has a daughter with cerebral palsy too, so a lot of the experiences are interwoven into the text. And Temple Grandin is a biography told in the third person. It will become clear why I look at voice and who's telling the story a little bit later on. So let's go through another lens that I use, and I look at different models of disability that are portrayed in the text. And I'm sure we could add to these models together if we were working at using different books. But the models that I saw across just the 4 texts I'm going to talk about today are a charity model, where maybe the focus is fix the tragedy, a medical model with a focus of fix the deviance, a social model where we're really looking at the environment as a means to support disability. I've also got here an affirmative model, which I would say was probably something like fix the mindset if we're thinking of a focus, and what I'm calling a generative model, which I think is about fixing the future. So I'll talk a little bit more. I don't think charity, medical or social models need too much explanation, right? Okay. The affirmative model, I'm basing that on kind of Swain and French's work and kind of seeing disability pride, and I think that's a really important element to see in the text. For me it becomes a little bit complicated given the people that I have worked with who've been incredibly stigmatized over the years, and some of the kids that I worked with had many years of being in school and actually feeling quite traumatized by it, of the kinds of experience. They, on the whole, have not been people who would identify by disability first. They've been subjected to be called retarded and all manner of things, and so they kind of want to see themselves first. So there's a big people's first movement among some of the people that I've worked with. So the affirmative model, it can be quite difficult for them. What I really like, and that I've seen in all of the books that I'm introducing today, is a generative model, and I'm basing that name on some work done by Rosemary, a lot of work done by Rosemary Garland Thompson. And I was lucky enough to go to a keynote speech of hers just a few weeks ago. She was very much talking about the generative nature of disability, and seeing how disability enriches the world and contributes a lot of creativity and innovation. And I think, like the affirmative model of disability, it's very positive, but I don't think it excludes people being able to maybe see themselves first at times, or to consider other experiences that haven't been positive with disability. For example, a lot of people I've worked with have gone through a lot of physical and emotional pain. So I really like her work, and I don't think I've got time to go through here, but I was imagining on this section here what people would say given those different lenses. And I certainly will be looking at texts to see what kinds of models we see in these texts. And in Paperboy, we see a medical, social and generative model. In Words in the Dust, there's a charity model and a medical model and a generative model. Out of My Mind and Temple Grandin kind of have this medical model, social model, affirmative model and generative model. And I think what I will do is just maybe elaborate on a couple of these texts so you can get the picture. I don't think we've got time to talk about them all. I want to give you an opportunity to talk too. So Paperboy, as I said, is an semi-autobiographical novel. Victor, the 11-year-old boy in the novel, experiences stuttering, and so much so that he can't say a word without a stutter. And he's a great baseball player, and he assumes his friend Art, whom he calls Rat, his paper round for the summer. He's really fine about throwing the papers, but he's very worried when it's going to come to Friday nights and having to extract money out of the customers and going to people's doors. So at the beginning of the text, Victor talks a lot about his stutter, and he wants nothing more than to be kind of fixed by a speech-language pathologist. And he says, most people don't take the time to try and understand what's wrong with me and probably just figure out that I'm not right in the head. They get rid of me as fast as possible. So Victor is also, he comes from a fairly wealthy family. His dad is in financial services of some kind, and he's looked after predominantly by Nan, who is the African-American housekeeper. And it's through her encouragement and the encouragement of Mr. Spiro, who he meets on his paper round, that he actually starts to move away from this medical model. Mr. Spiro is an elderly man, and he loves language and reading, and he spends a lot of time with Victor. It's through his patients and Mam's patients that Victor actually will start to talk, and he shares books with Mr. Spiro, and Victor switches Mr. Spiro onto poetry, and he works out that when he's saying his own poems, and he actually sings and shouts them, that he no longer has a stutter. And Mr. Spiro also kind of says some very wise words to him. He quotes Voltaire, and he says, "Speech was given to man to disguise his thoughts." And so Victor starts to question whether speech is such a great thing. And so we start to see him move towards this social model of disability with supports in place, with patients, with people who love language. Victor can thrive. And as the novel progresses, I think we see a generative nature of disability too. It's because of Victor's stutter that he's absolutely brilliant at précis, because he wants to make things shorter, right, and not have to spend a long time talking. And he becomes very skillful at poetry and song. And he's really flourished with Mr. Spiro's encouragement. And it's through this experience that he then starts tackling some of the bullying that he's experienced. He also starts to confront a junk man in the neighbourhood who's pretty abusive, has stolen his paper knife to cut the papers, and he won't give it back to Victor unless he can articulate the word knife, which Victor never can. But what is really nice too is that Victor starts to see other oppressions. He starts seeing how segregation works. He starts seeing that one of the people on the paper round is being abused by her husband and perhaps by her brother physically. And he then starts questioning normalcy. Is normalcy such a great thing, when normalcy also means segregation? It means domestic violence. And I think there are so many powerful things here, and this one does end on a positive note too. And in what I like to it, I don't like just to look in the text, I'm always looking at what people are saying on reviews, what's in the end notes, what's on the blurb and things. And in the end note, author Vince Porter says, he has never been cured of his stuttering, rather he's learned compensatory strategies. And these strategies made him especially cognizant of subtle nuances in language, able to pick up on non-verbal cues, and tuned into the way people interacted or refused to interact with each other. And in fact, in adulthood, he became a newspaper editor and kind of was very interested in the segregated South where he worked and questioned a lot of societal ills. So this book reminds me of what Rosemary Garland Thompson observes about the artist Claude Monet and the photographer Chuck Close, and when she says they didn't overcome their disabilities, but rather they accommodated their disabilities and their art changed. And so a pretty powerful thing. We'll just go on to talk a little bit about Words in the Dust. Words in the Dust is loosely based on the author's experiences in Afghanistan. The plot follows a charity medical model at first, in that cleft palate is seen as something to be cured, and that something to be cured, it's seen by the author, it's seen by Zulayeka, the girl he meets, and it's seen by her family. And it's also seen that fixing will need the beneficence of others. So, well, there's that model going on. And I don't think that any of these models are mutually exclusive. Readers also see that Zulayeka's cleft palate makes her especially interested in expressing herself and finding out more about language. In fact, she starts to learn to read, and none of her family are able to read. She secretly goes off and meets a very influential woman. Her disability is actually kind of the driving force between her interest in literacy and education. And so through Zulayeka we also see a kind of generative nature of disability. And there's a twist in the plot because Zulayeka has a sister, Zainab, and Zainab is supposed to be very beautiful. There's a lot of talk about when Zainab's going to get married, and she does get married. She's married off to a man 3 times her age, who's kind of a wealthy colleague, well not colleague, a man who's a kind of boss who might give her father some kind of payback and more work in the reconstruction effort. And so Zainab becomes married and kind of disparages education for women. And within a short while, she becomes the subject of domestic violence, and she dies in a mysterious fire. So one starts to question whether this normal pattern of events, the normalcy, is actually what Zulayeka will aspire to. And so Zulayeka is found by the Americans, and they pool money to perform corrective surgery. And when the corrective surgery is done, we then also start to wonder, well, will she get married off like Zainab? It's not such a great thing. Now, I think the story is definitely complex, and there's a lot that I like about it. But it was looking at interviews with the author, Trent Reedy, that I felt saddened because disability again got very much reduced to the charity medical model. Within the book there are authorial notes, and there's an interview that he did with Children's Literature in 2011, and we very much see that he sees disability as an abnormality that needs to be fixed, and of course fixed by Americans out of charity and pity. And he says this: "When my unit encountered a brave young girl named Zulayeka who suffered from cleft lip and crooked teeth, we knew we had to help. My fellow soldiers and I pooled our money to pay for her flight and our flight to the main base in Afghanistan, where the army doctor had volunteered to conduct corrective surgery. After the surgery, Zulayeka's problems with her upper lip, teeth, nose had vanished, almost as if she had always been completely normal. Her physical transformation was amazing, but perhaps more striking was her emotional change. She no longer hid her mouth in shame. The very best moment of my time in Afghanistan was seeing Zulayeka smile." So the points I want to make about this are that when this model of disability is reduced to that kind of charity model, it again becomes what David Mitchell and Sharon Snyder would say was kind of like a prosthetic to assure non-disabled readers about their comparative good fortunes. They point to the fact that generally within those kinds of books, disability is first kind of spotted as kind of a deviance to the reader, and then the consequence of the deviance are explained, and then the deviance moves from the periphery right to the centre of the text, and it's fixed somehow. So it's kind of a classic for that. Another point I'd like to make is that I feel that Trent Reedy has kind of positioned himself as a collaborative writer. In the author's note, he recognises the problem of telling a story about Afghan girls is out of culture and out from outside of the gender. And he says that he felt compelled to tell the story himself because 87% of the girls in Afghanistan are illiterate, and he said in Farah province, where he was working, more like 99% were illiterate. So he felt legitimate in telling her story. But I kind of come to Tom Cowser's work a little bit. Anybody familiar with Tom Cowser's work? Great. So in Making, Taking and Faking Lies, Voice and Vulnerability in Collaborative Life Writing, he explains the ethical issues of being a collaborative life writer, particularly in exploring I Raise My Eyes to Say Yes, and Down All the Days. And he says that sort of one person becomes the person who supplies the writing, and the other person supplies the life. One form of this life writing that he discusses is kind of that ethnographic life writing, which becomes a little bit like a slave narrative, where the agendas of European and American writers shape the stories. Because of Zuleika's impairments and other societal oppressions, she's placed among the category of people who don't write and has no opportunity to review and mandate changes to the text. So these are kind of models that I would look through. Have I got about 10 more minutes, do you think, David?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, if people need to leave, that's fine, but I will just go on. There are a couple of other lenses that I use too. Thirsty Wyatt talking, isn't it? I think it's good to explore different types of aggressions that go on in books, partly because it's very easy to skate over these, and I think without discussion you're almost saying this is okay. And as I said, I don't like censorship, but I think everything needs to be kind of unpacked. So we're obviously very familiar with physical forms of aggression and cruelty, and we definitely see those in the two books that I've just mentioned. In Paperboy, the junk man Arati is really abusive when he won't give the knife back to Victor, and in Words in the Dust, Zuleika is the boys throw stones at her, they chase her, they treat her abominably. So we can see full forms of aggression. But we also see a lot of microaggressions. I don't know whether anybody here is familiar with the work of Daryl Wynne-Soon. Microaggressions are a lens of looking at things that happen. I guess he started working through the lens of racial microaggressions, and he's identified three subsets of microaggressions. First, there are microaggressions that he calls micro-assaults, and these would be slurs, derogatory kind of slurs and beliefs that reinforce barriers to equality, and they're very ostracizing. So within these books, Zuleika's called Donkey Face, Temple Grandin and Melody out of my mind are both called retard at different points in the text. So those would be micro-assaults. Micro-insults and micro-invalidations are two other forms of aggressions that happen. And these happen at a much more subtle level, but they still happen. And when Daryl Sue, who's looked at kind of these things in terms of race, gender, as well, he said when they happen, it's not as though you're immediately necessarily conscious of them. And a lot of people who are have microaggressive behaviours are really unaware of what they're doing. So when looking at race, for example, Dr. Sue looked at, sort of maybe women grabbing their bag when they're walking down the street when they encounter an African-American male, and it's how many times does that man have to see the bag being grabbed to feel that sort of there's something wrong with him. And so there are kind of different kinds of forms, or when people go by in Southern California and lock their doors immediately in their cars, how many times do you have to hear that click to know that sort of people think that you're going to attack them and things. So with micro-insults, there can be verbal micro-insults, and that would be suggesting that somebody got something through a quota system. And in one of the books, Out of My Mind, Melody is taking part of a spelling bee, and she's using her lap tray with the alphabet on it and telling her assistant how she's spelling a word, and when she wins, one of the other children says, "That's not fair, she's cheating." So they can't bearing the thought that someone might need an accommodation and not understanding the accommodation. Verbal microaggressions are often couched in kind of almost a complimentary language, so it's very hard for somebody to say, talk back to it. In Paperboy, Victor goes to a restaurant with his parents and he's trying to order spaghetti and it comes out all wrong, and a woman at another table bursts out laughing, and he says here, she says that your son is such a darling. The woman put in extra W's in the word, like she was trying to make up to my parents for laughing at me. So that would be an example of a micro-insult. And then there are also micro-invalidations, and this is all these kind of communications that very subtly exclude or nullify the thoughts that people with disabilities might have, or their experiential reality. In Words in the Dust, for example, Captain Mindy, who Zuleika goes to at the base, really makes very little of the corrective surgery, and she says to Zuleika, "Don't be afraid, you won't feel a thing," just before the corrective surgery. And then Out of My Mind, Melody, when she gets the top score in the Whiz Kids practice test during a spelling bee, her teacher actually says, "Well, if Melody won, my test can't be demanding enough," So these are other ways to look at aggression as well. And then there's one more lens that I use, and that's kind of what's the intersectionality within the book. We were talking a little bit about this last night, David. When we just look at disability on its own, I think disability certainly deserves its own lens. But when we don't connect it to other oppressions in society, we lose part of the picture, and we lose the ability, I think, to answer back to some of those oppressions. So I very much look in text as through, are there other things going on? In Paperboy and Words in the Dust, we see intersectionality of race, gender and class. In Words in the Dust, race and gender. In Temple Grandin, there's a lot of discussion about gender issues too. How autism was seen by the psychiatrist as a form of childhood schizophrenia brought on by the cold parenting of her mother. She gets to work in the sciences, and she's very much at first kind of put off from doing that because she's a woman. She goes to work in the animal cattle industry, and she experiences kind of a lot of abuse there too. So I think it's useful to look at these different fronts at the same time and unpack these with kids if we're going to make progress. So just to finish up, yes, the single story creates stereotypes, and the problem with stereotypes is not that they're untrue, but they are incomplete. They make the one story become the only story. I'm sure some of you have seen the TED Talk by Chimamanda Adichie, the Nigerian author, and I like to have an interweaving of stories too in the text. So I really do see books can be used as a way to support relationships and reduce the desire for social distance and stigma. Lindsay Cameron and Adam Rutland in the UK actually did a study with kids using books where there were friendships of people with disabilities and who identified as without disabilities, and saw they had a powerful effect on kids and reduction of stigma and prejudice. I think we need to find more and better texts. You know, what I've shown you today, there are far better texts, and when I say texts, I don't mean textbooks, far better stories than when I was first looking. But we need more of them, and more varied and different types and different sorts of intersectionality. The Schneider Family Book Award in the United States is given for books that can portray disability. The Dolly Gray Award is an award given for intellectual disabilities that are portrayed. I certainly recommend you get in touch with IBI UK and find out who's on the committee for the outstanding books for young people with disabilities too. There are a number of books I've been looking at that we could use the same different kind of lenses as I was doing today, that all consider communication and disabled voices. This one I've got a lot of questions about. It came out recently, When Mr. Dog Bites. It's by Brian Conaghan, and it's about a character with Tourette's syndrome. If anybody here is looking for something to study for their master's project, I think there'll be an awful lot to say here. I've got lots of thoughts, not altogether positive. Cameron and the Girls explores schizophreniform, a type of schizophrenia with young people, and we hear disabled voices in the protagonist's mind as well, and he communicates more with those. Again, this would be a great master's thesis to unpack this. And is there anybody who wants to become a teacher in the room? Or a librarian? Okay, I want to become one too. I'm still working on that goal. Or anybody who wants to work with kids in some way. You know, I think it's really good to have something where you can start having these conversations with kids, and I would actually think about using something like 10 Quick Ways. It doesn't have to be that one. I'd also really recommend teaching about disabilities through children's literature. It's a textbook produced by Marianne Prater and Tina Deiches. It has some great activities there where kids get to kind of think about their own experiences and identify personal, emotional and social and academic challenges, and then look at what's happening in the text. So it kind of personalises all the things that we go through at the human level. There's another activity that's a group activity where kids get to work in groups and start to unpack the idea of what is normal. They get different situations and decide whether something's normal, and they have to have a discussion about where there's a situation where they have least agreement. And I think it turns normalcy on its head, and they again have to do this with books as well. So, folks, I feel like I've been speaking at 5 million miles an hour. We could go through tons of books. I want to know your questions and thoughts.